All right. Hello, everyone. Go ahead and going to get started now that it's 12:03. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Zachary Poe, and I'm the Associate Director of Volunteering Class Engagement here at Rollins. Before we get started, I'd like to share a couple of housekeeping items. We'll spend the second half of the event doing Q&A. We received some questions submitted ahead of time, as well as we'll have the opportunity for participants to submit questions during the event, during the chat feature at the bottom right. You can submit your questions to be viewable by everyone, or you can select the host option to submit them directly to me anonymously. We will try to answer as many questions as time allows, but we will try to get to both questions submitted ahead of time and questions submitted during the event. With that said, I'd like to go ahead and welcome our speakers for today's discussion. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our special guest, Dr. Micah Kubic, Executive Director of the Florida ACLU, and Dr. Smaw, Associate Professor of Philosophy here at Rollins College, and one of our exemplary students, Marcus Davis. For Dr. Kubic, he's an executive with more than 20 years of experience in civil rights and racial justice work. Dr. Kubic leads one of the largest advocacy organizations in the state defending constitutional rights. He holds a bachelor's degree from the George Washington University, as well as a master's and doctorate in Black politics from Howard University. His first book, Freedom, Inc., and a Black Political Empowerment, was published by University of Missouri Press in 2016. Dr. Smaw is a professor of philosophy here and an adjunct professor of medical ethics at FSU School of Medicine, Orlando campus. He received his PhD in legal philosophy and ethics from the University of Kentucky and has published numerous articles on critical race theory, human rights, and global ethics. In addition, he currently serves on the national board of the ACLU. Marcus Davis is an MBA student in the Crummer Graduate School of Business and a graduate hall director with the Rollins College Residential Life and Explorations team. In addition, he holds an assistant position with Crummer, helping racial justice and leadership development. Marcus holds a bachelor's degree in international business and is expected to graduate Crummer in 2022 with his master's degree in business administration. With Marcus as our discussion guide, I'm going to let him go ahead and begin with our first questions.
Thank you very much, Zach. Thank you very much, Zach, for the introduction. Thank you again, Dr. Kubic and Dr. Smaw, for taking the time to join us for an important conversation. Thank you all for being a part of this. And my role today will be asking the guests the guiding questions for the discussion. My first question for the two of you will be, what is racism and what are its different forms?
Dr. Kubic, would you like to start us off on that discussion?
Sure. Thank you all very much for having me here today. It's really a pleasure. I'm happy to spend a little bit of time with you. Happy to be on the panel. Happy especially to be here with my friend, Dr. Eric Smaw. He is a brilliant scholar, a great activist, and just an all-around good guy. So take his class, administration, give him a raise. He's just a great guy, and I'm happy to be here with him. More relevant to the question at hand, so what is racism? There are a bunch of different definitions of racism. You type it into Google, you'll get 20,000 different answers, all of them proclaiming themselves to be the one true definition of racism. You might have even heard over the summer that Merriam-Webster, the dictionary people, updated their definition of racism because of some feedback that they received that it wasn't sufficient. So you can find a million different ways to characterize this. The definition that I like best, which I think is not perfect, but which I think is serviceable, comes from a historian of racism named George Fredrickson, who says that racism is the idea when differences that exist between people and groups are ascribed to something innate, something natural, something indelible, something unchangeable about that group. And when that idea of difference, of natural difference, is used to support, to create, to prolong a system of hierarchy, where some people are on top and others are on bottom, and where that is defined, reinforced because of that sort of racial identity. And I think it's really important that we focus not just on the idea, not just the idea of difference, but on the systems and structures that are used to reinforce that difference and make sure that some people are treated better than others. There's personal racism, there's systemic racism, structural racism, there's de facto racism, the kind that just sort of exists without anyone formally naming it as such, and de jure racism, things that are codified by law. But all of these have in common the idea that there are these innate differences based on group identity, and that they should then be reinforced through hierarchy. I also think it's important to distinguish between racism and just rank bigotry. Bigotry is disliking or hating a group based on their group identity. It doesn't really require you to think about superiority or inferiority. It's just pure hatred. Now, oftentimes these things go together, racism and bigotry, like mashed potatoes and gravy. You'll find them together more often than apart, but they're still two different independent things. And that's why throughout American history, you can find all sorts of virulent white supremacists who could say that they loved an individual Black person or Black people in general while still believing in their inferiority.
And in short, I believe Dr. Kubic hit the nail on the head. He talked about all aspects of racism and gave us an excellent analysis of those. So I have nothing to say.
Thank you, Dr. Smaw. So now that we have a great understanding of what racism is, I'd like to continue on that and ask, is America a racist country?
Dr. Kubic, why don't you start off and then I'll follow up?
Sure. So I think the answer is an unambiguous yes. I think there's no way around it. The answer is that historically, America has been a racist country, and today, America is a racist country. That does not mean that every single person walking the streets of America is a virulent white supremacist, but it does mean that the structures and the systems that we have in this country historically have reinforced white supremacy especially, and that they do so today. It also does mean that there have been plenty of individual people who have been racist, both in the past and today. It doesn't mean that the country is irredeemable. It doesn't mean that we cannot change. It does not mean that there are not good things about the country. It does not mean that every single moment has been completely infected in every single way with racism and white supremacy. But it does mean that on the whole, we should just acknowledge things for what they are. And you can go back to when the country started or before. You can go back to 1619 when the first African people landed at Jamestown, Virginia. They did not come voluntarily. They were not immigrants in the sense of the world of deciding to come to America for a better life. They were brought here in servitude, and that sort of characteristic carried through into the future. You can look at 1787. When the country was founded, when the Constitution was signed, 1787, only 6% of the people who lived in this country were even eligible to vote. 6% of the people who lived in the country were eligible to vote. Just rich white men, not just men, not just white men, rich white men. Now, we can say that clearly the country was sexist and classist at the same time, but we should not deny the fact that if you are saying that only rich white men are eligible to vote, that is a racist thing to do. We all know that slavery existed in this country until the 1860s, and in some ways beyond. That is clearly a racist thing. We know about the sort of reign of terror in the South, including in Florida, during the years of the Black Codes and Jim Crow. That is a racist thing. We know about the civil rights movement and the hurdles that folks had to overcome in order to combat racism. They didn't march through Selma. They didn't march throughout the country. They didn't sit on or not sit on boycott buses to be able to sit because racism didn't exist. They did it because it did exist, and they were fighting back against it. I think we should also be clear, yes, this is Black History Month. I want to celebrate and acknowledge Black history and Black futures. We should be clear that this should not just be a month to look backwards, but to look forwards about what can be and how we can celebrate and uplift Black joy as well as Black struggle. But even though it is Black History Month, we should also acknowledge that there has been plenty of racism against other groups in this country as well. Native Americans. Not only do we know about sort of the conquest of the country, did you know that it was not until 1924, not even 100 years ago, 1924, that Congress passed a law, the Snyder Act, to say that Native Americans were citizens of this country. They passed a law in 1924 to say that Native Americans, the people who were here first, were citizens of the country. The fact that you have to do that tells you everything you need to know about the racial climate and racial nature of the country. So historically, I think there is not a shadow of a doubt, that this has been a racist country with racist people and racist structures. Lots of proud anti-racist people, lots of times where we have changed our structures to make them more anti-racist, but we shouldn't lie about who we are, where we've been, where we've come from, or where we're going.
Thank you, Micah. I think that was an excellent analysis of the distinction between the structures of racism and racist acts committed by people. And I'll follow your distinction because in the contemporary world, we find that people say, well, racism ended in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, or in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. And so these people believe that the distinction between systems of racism and individual racist acts is enough to tell us that the systems ended with the passages of those acts. But of course, you can't stop people from being individual racists. But when I'm in these conversations, I often point out that just 5 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, did we get the Nixon administration. And you and I know well that the Nixon administration sought to reinstitute institutional racism in the form of the war on drugs. And we know this to be a fact because H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff for Richard Nixon, told us, and I'll quote him here, President Nixon deliberately pursued a racist strategy. He emphasized that we have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the Blacks, and that the key is to devise a system that recognizes this without appearing to do so. And of course, the system that they came up with was the war on drugs. And this all was confirmed by a White House lawyer and an aide to Richard Nixon, John Ehrlichman, who did an interview in Harper's Magazine and said, and I'll quote Ehrlichman here, the Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. By getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So often when people have these conversations, they want to try to draw a distinction between what happened before the 1960s and what happened after 1960s, where there's ample evidence that the racism continued after the 1960s and the institutional structures of the state. In fact, in 2016, Congress passed H.R. 46, a bill which told us that in many states throughout the country, the policing agencies in Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, Florida, had engaged in false arrests of African Americans, coerced witnesses, tampered with evidence, and all of this in an effort to get wrongful convictions of African Americans. Today, the Innocence Project tells us that this has been happening for years, and the result of it is 50% of those who are exonerated for murder are African American. 59% of those who are exonerated for sexual assault are African American, and 62% of those who are exonerated for robbery are African American. This tells us one thing, that policing agencies throughout the country have been arresting innocent people, wrongfully convicting them, and leaving them to rot in jail. So if the question is America racist in the contemporary world? The answer is obviously yes.
Wow. Thank you very much for that historical and contemporary analysis. I would like to kind of narrow in and bring this up locally and ask, is Florida a racist state?
So Florida is one of the 50 states of the United States. We are united in many things in this country, and we are united there too. So Florida is clearly a racist state. The same statements that I made before about what that really means apply for Florida as well. But again, I think you can look historically at this state and say that Florida has been one of the historical battlegrounds against racism. Florida was part of the Confederacy. Sometimes people want to pretend now like Florida is not part of the South, and yet it very clearly, you can look at a map, right? Like pretty far south on the map, all the other states around it were part of the Confederacy. Florida was too. And I say that not just to sort of make a geographic point, right, but to say that all of the baggage, all of the historical baggage, all of the historical problems that we see that are not unique to the South, not unique to the places of the former Confederacy, but sometimes more overt, have showed up in Florida as well. Right after the Civil War ended, Florida was very sparsely populated, right? Like Orlando had maybe 500 people, right? Like South Florida basically didn't exist. There was no megalopolis of South Florida. There was no megalopolis of Tampa Bay. The population was one of the smaller southern states and largely concentrated up in North Florida, where there's agricultural land and where enslaved people had been working. And so after the Civil War, Florida is almost 50% Black. Not quite, but about 48, 49% African American right after the Civil War. And there were a whole lot of folks who didn't like that, who didn't like the fact that political power might now be shared with people who are not white, who are not men, who are not rich. And so right away, Florida began instituting some of the most vicious suppression tools of Black voting in particular, but also all the other forms of racism that come along with that. Florida was, you may not know, Florida was the very first state in the country to institute a poll tax. That notorious tool where folks had to pay money to be able to vote in order to discourage voting. Florida was the very first state to pass a poll tax. Florida had the grandfather clause. Florida had the literacy test. Florida broke new ground, did something that no one else did, creating something called the 8-box rule. The 8-box rule, which said that each ballot, each race, each candidate running, right, had its own ballot and its own box that you had to put the ballot in. And there were 8 of them, hence the 8-box rule. And they would just write on the box what ballot you were supposed to put in it. Well, guess what? In the 1870s, a whole lot of folks couldn't read or write, especially folks who had recently been enslaved. Most people, regardless of race or anything else, voted based on pictures, right? They picked the logo of the political party that they were voting for, didn't really read the names. They didn't put any pictures on the boxes, they just put words in order to make it so that folks put the ballot in the wrong box and then they could disqualify the ballot. And why did they do that? They said it specifically at the time that they were doing it to make it harder for recently enslaved Black people to vote. Florida in the 1860s passed a constitutional amendment that said that you would be permanently disenfranchised if you ever had a felony conviction. And when they did that, the legislators, the people who were elected to represent the state, stood in the well of the Capitol and proclaimed loudly their commitment to white supremacy and said that they were doing that specifically to make it harder for Black men to vote. They said, we'll say you can't vote if you're convicted of a felony, and then we'll add all sorts of new felonies that we can convict you of so that we have a 2-step process here. They said it out loud. It's not secret. You ain't got to know a secret handshake. You don't have to be a member of a secret club. They said it out loud in the newspaper for everybody to see. And I tell that story just because it sets the tone for what comes later. It sets the tone for the campaign of lynchings that takes place across Florida in the late 19th and early 20th century. It sets the tone for the criminal justice system that we see today, for the lack of police accountability that we see today, for the wealth gap between Blacks and whites that we see today. The tone was set then and continues. You cannot run away from your history. You can change it, you can make the future different, but you cannot run away from it. And that means we have to acknowledge it and carve out the things that we need to do differently so that the history does not continue to be the present.
Thank you, Micah, for that historical analysis. And now you all see why I like to present with Micah, because he tells it straightforward like it is. And he talked about setting the tone, and Florida set a very racist tone. In 1920, we had the Ocoee Massacre. Micah talked about the shift in power, given the increase in numbers in African Americans that came to Florida after the Civil War, and that 50% of the African people in the state of Florida were African American. And there was an African American male, July Perry, who had registered to vote. As a result of him registering to vote, the sheriff of Ocoee went over to the white side of town, gathered up a posse of over 1,000 white men, deputized them, and this is important, deputized them, directed them at the black side of Ocoee, and when they got there, they indiscriminately killed African Americans. They burned down homes in the black side of town and stole property. Today, the property that was stolen from them in the 1920s is still in the hands of European Americans. In fact, the mayor of Ocoee is married to a woman whose family has July Perry's property from the Ocoee Massacre in 1920. And just 3 years after Ocoee, there was the Rosewood Massacre. And the Rosewood Massacre occurred because a European American woman accused an African American male of rape after her husband learned that she was engaged in an extramarital affair. Of course, the same thing happened. A sheriff showed up with a posse of deputized people, and then they destroyed the entire community. Now, today, we don't know how many African Americans died in the Ocoee Massacre or in the Rosewood Massacre, simply because law enforcement never cared to find out. And the reason why they didn't care to find out is because they had participated in it by deputizing people and by going over to the communities with them and participating in the killings. And this is why I believe that the state of Florida is responsible and that the state of Florida has an obligation to correct things and make them right, as Micah told you that we could do in correcting our history. But that happened in history, and Florida hasn't changed much in the contemporary world. Because I talked earlier about false arrests and wrongful convictions, and Florida has a long history of those too. You would have heard about the Central Park 5. Well, Florida has the Groveland 4. And the Groveland 4 case is a case where a European American woman accused African American teenagers of raping her. And then, you know the story, the sheriff showed up with a posse. The posse shot one of the young men 400 times. They arrested 2 of them. Sheriff McCall arrested 2 of them, took them to the jail, handcuffed them, and then shot them while they were in police custody and handcuffed. The 4th person was later wrongfully convicted and thrown in jail to waste away. As Micah told you, all of this set the ground for Florida to continue with false arrests and wrongful convictions. As late as 2018, we find that a sheriff in Miami was directing his officers to indiscriminately arrest African American men and pin unsolved crimes on them. This happened in Biscayne Park, Florida, and we have the recording of it from July of 2018. So Florida was racist in the past. There is still much institutional racism in Florida in the future. So if we're going to change any of this, we have a lot of serious work to do.
I'm glad you brought up the work that we have to do in the future. So moving forward, for both myself and those who might be new to the topic, The final question I'd like to ask from our guiding questions is, what can I do individually to eliminate racism in America and in my local community?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot you can do, and I think it starts where Dr. Smaw, where Eric left off, which is like we first need to acknowledge that the racism of the past is not of the past, but is of this moment too. Florida continues to be a racist state, right? I mean, the prison population in this state has grown 1,000% over the last 40 years. 100,000 people are in Florida prisons today, and 60% of them are either African American or Latino. About 25–30% of the state's population is African American and Hispanic, and yet 60% of the prison population is African American or Hispanic. Now, I don't care who you are. I don't care where you come from. I don't care what your political party is. I don't care what you think. You have to look at those numbers and say that something has gone badly wrong in the social contract, in the way we interact with each other. Something is wrong in the system, as it should be, if 60% of the folks are African American and Hispanic. If you have that kind of disparity, especially since we know that nationwide, right? African Americans are 12% of the population, 11% of the drug users, that is, use drugs less than white people do, but 50% of those in prison for drug crimes. Something is wrong, something is amiss, and that something is racism, right? So we have to acknowledge where we are. We have to acknowledge the wealth gap that exists today. We have to acknowledge the way that our voting rights policies still harm African Americans. Black ballots are twice as likely to be rejected as white ballots are. We have to acknowledge that xenophobia is a form of racism, that picking on immigrants is a form of racism, especially as it's practiced in this state. And we have to acknowledge all that stuff so that we can do something about it. And what we need to do about it is change the systems, change the structures, change the policies that are leading to those outcomes. A lot of folks want to talk about, oh, we need to change hearts and minds first. I don't give a flying rat's behind about changing hearts and minds, to tell you the truth. Like, it's a nice thing if it happens. It would be a good thing. I would be happy if everyone suddenly were wanting to walk through the meadow hand in hand with racial justice and equality. But your heart and mind isn't the thing that is locking people in behind bars. Hearts and minds are not the thing that is denying a ballot. Hearts and minds are not the thing that is resulting in racial profiling. Hearts and minds are not, at least by themselves, the thing that are resulting in especially Black men being murdered by police. The thing that is doing all of that is racism in the structures, in the policies, in the systems that we have. And so you, as an individual, yes, look into your heart, gaze into it, find the areas where you need to improve. I need to do that. We all need to do that. But then take that energy and direct it outwards towards advocating for change in policy, whether it be at your city council, at your county commission, at the state legislature, at the Congress. I don't care where it is. Pick the place where there is an issue that you care deeply about, something that really bothers you. Find the racial injustice that is happening on that issue, and then speak out about it to change the policy itself. Don't just engage in conversation with others about how it would be nice if we all lived in an enlightened world. That's nice. That's talk. Talk is cheap. I would much rather that you spend your time advocating, organizing, mobilizing to create policy change.
That was excellent, Micah. And so now I'll just talk about some of the policies that need to be changed and what you can do as an ordinary citizen. Often we look at extraordinary behavior from the past. We look at Dr. King's civil rights movement, or we look at the Montgomery bus boycott spearheaded by Rosa Parks, and we say, look, this stuff is too extraordinary. I can't engage in those extraordinary actions. That's okay, because there's a lot that ordinary people can do. So I'll talk about some ordinary actions that anybody can do. Okay, the first thing you can do is write to Congress. You can write to your legislators in your state and to your legislators at the federal level. Police have something called qualified immunity. This is why you see so many policemen shooting people and not going to jail for it. In short, what qualified immunity means is that a police officer cannot be arrested and thrown in jail for killing somebody unless there has been a previous precedent set that is sufficiently similar to his case. Well, you can see how this is going to be a problem because, as Dr. Kubic and I have pointed out, well, police officers wasn't being arrested and thrown in jail in the 60s for beating, brutalizing, or killing African Americans, so you're not going to find a precedent. And even if you do find a precedent, all a judge has to say is that the facts of the precedent that you are presenting aren't sufficiently similar to the case at hand and simply dismiss the case. And that's what judges have been doing. So the first thing to do, everyone, write Congress, your representatives in the House, your representatives in the Senate, and tell them to abolish qualified immunity. And if you want to offer a standard, tell them to adopt the necessary standard. That simply means that policemen can't use force unless it's the last resort, so they have to go through a chain of de-escalation. The other thing you might do is demand from your legislatures. This is at the state level, right? Your state representatives in the House and in the Senate, telling them that you want mandatory compensation for people who have been wrongfully convicted and falsely arrested and wrongfully convicted. You want mandatory compensation. You want mandatory rehabilitation in the form of things like education social services and mental health social services so that they can be reintroduced back into society. You also want the felony removed off their record because we all know that once you have a felony on your record, you won't be able to vote. You won't be able to find a well-paying job. Many apartments will reject you and housing will reject you, so you won't be able to find a place to stay. And when I talk about this, I like to point out something, that even if once you've gotten a felony, even if you come out of jail and you want to rehabilitate and you find a job, let's assume you find a job at Walmart or McDonald's, it turns out that you are working and you are paying federal taxes to the government, but in many states you can't vote. This, my friends, is taxation without representation, and we need to remove it immediately. So tell your representatives that we'd like to remove that. And then thirdly, you want the State Department or the Department of Justice to do a review of all policing agencies in the country. I say this because in 2006, the FBI produced a report demonstrating that the Ku Klux Klan has infiltrated many policing agencies throughout this country. And so if you're wondering, why is it that police are shooting people in the back? Sometimes it's because they're members of domestic terrorists and white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan or the Proud Boys. And so what we need to do is get those people out of policing. It might be a small batch of bad actors. Often you hear people say, it's just a few bad actors. I can accept that, but you can see the great devastation that a small group of bad actors can cause, as Micah and I cite to you the number of African Americans who are in prison as a result of this small bad actor group. And they're in prison often because of false arrests and wrongful convictions. The number of African Americans who end up with felonies, even though they're innocent and have no way of correcting those things. And so first what you have to do is get politically active. You have to write to your congressmen and women, and you have to stay on them. Also, you can join local organizations. The ACLU is one organization you might join. The League of Women Voters is another organization you might join. Maybe you'll join the NAACP or My Brother's Keepers. There are many local organizations who are doing this work. They need help in two ways. One, they need people to volunteer to help in those organizations to get the work done. I suggest you do that. Also, they need money. You can't get the work done unless you have money. So donate to those organizations. They don't have a minimum amount of money you can donate. $5, $1, $20 will do to help the cause. So those are two things that anyone can do, and they don't require extraordinary expertise or action.
Thank you very much. I think we have a lot of action items that we can move forward with in trying to individually eliminate racism in America. So with our guiding questions being answered, now is a great time to move forward into our user-submitted questions. We will start with questions that were submitted on a registration form, and we will include questions that are asked in the chat. If we have time. But as a reminder, you can submit questions to the chat by messaging our host, Zachary Pope. We will try to answer as many questions as time allows. So with that being said, I'm going to get started. So is there a list of books or resources that you can recommend to make up for the fact that our teachings of history have been either inaccurate at best or not at all when it comes to Black experience?
Yes, Micah, I'll defer to you to answer that first, and then I'll pick up afterwards.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a huge number of books that are useful. It really depends on what you're interested in, right? There are all sorts of books about the civil rights movement, for example, lots of first-person accounts that I think are great there, John Lewis, Andrew Young, others. There are great books about the post-Reconstruction period. So W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is obviously a classic. There's a great book by a guy I like a lot, Vincent Harding, a great historian who does sort of a one-volume history called There Is a River, which I think is probably my favorite sort of one book on summing everything up. And then I think there's a great book by a guy named Sterling Stuckey called Slave Culture, which is about how this narrative that folks sometimes have that enslaved people didn't have a culture of their own is complete nonsense, and the ways that the culture that was formed during the enslavement period, particularly how folks came together and the political ideas that they formed still are with us today and shape a lot of the conversation. So there's gobs of great books. Pick any of them up and read, and you'll do yourself a service, really.
So I'll add to that, and I'll talk about books that you might get. I'll talk about movies that you might watch, and then I'll talk about activities that you can participate in. So you might buy really, really excellent books that do an excellent job of offering you an analysis of history. So David Cole has a book called No Equal Justice. Michelle Alexander has a book called The New Jim Crow. And Kendi has a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. So those are three books that are excellent books to start with that I think anybody can pick up and read through. That's Michelle Alexander, New Jim Crow, David Cole's book, No Equal Justice, and Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And then in terms of movies, there are really good movies that have been produced that could help move you forward, and they're easily digestible. So movies that I think are easily digestible for anybody are Hidden Figures. It's an excellent movie, and it's easily digestible. You don't need a lot of background information to understand what was going on. And there's another movie called Harriet, and it's about slavery and Harriet Tubman's escape from slavery, and then her return using the Underground Railroad to liberate other slaves. And then a part of her life that I was happy to see that they included in the movie was the fact that she is the only female in American history to serve as a general in an army and lead people into war. So they talk about that in the movie Harriet. I think it's an excellent movie and you can watch it. And then there's a third movie called Selma. It's about the march in Selma, Montgomery, the march from Montgomery to Selma in Alabama. So I think those are great movies you can sit down and watch with your family, your children. They're age appropriate, and you can have a conversation to start the education going on in your household. And then I like to tell people, after you've watched some movies, then move forward to engage in activities. When you go on a trip with your family to Washington, D.C., for example, stop by the African American History Museum, get some pamphlets, walk through the museum, talk to curators, so they can help you understand what you're seeing. But you'll see a dearth of information about the history of the African American struggle and liberation. And then if you don't want to travel as far as DC, you can travel to Alabama. There's something called the Equal Justice Initiative Museum. It's an excellent museum. I've been there myself. I'm planning to go again. And I would suggest that you take your family. It's a short 7-hour drive. Take your family, go to the museum. And so you can read books as a family. You can watch movies as a family, and you can do activities as a family, like go to museums, to help you understand the history of racism in America.
Thank you very much. All great resources. Just a reminder for everybody that attended is in our follow-up email to this event, we will provide a list of readings on these topics recommended by Dr. Smaw and Dr. Kubic, just in case you didn't get those. Our next question is kind of a two-part question. So we have several questions about navigating both social and workplace situations. What are strategies for navigating difficult social situations, like when someone says a racist joke or shares some misinformation? Our second question will be attached with this would be, what advice would you give to someone who wants to advocate for anti-racism or diversity and inclusion practices in the workplace?
Okay, again, Dr. Kubic, I'll be happy to defer to you and then follow up.
All right. I think these are situations that happen a lot. I think that certainly of late there has been greater awareness when they are happening, and I think that is itself a sign that folks are more committed to anti-racism than they have been in the past, right? The awareness and recognition of these incidents, because it's not as though they've just started happening, right? It's just not all of a sudden that folks have started making inappropriate comments or saying things that are wrong, hurtful, false. That is of long history. I think when that happens, when you have to respond in a way that is polite but firm about what's happening and why it's wrong. I think we have to acknowledge that sometimes when these things happen, there are power dynamics that are in place, though, that make people, including those who are the targets of the comment or the incident, feel like they cannot speak out without further marginalizing or compromising their own position, their own safety in many cases, right? Sometimes we're talking about physical safety, not just safety in the job or something else. And so therefore, I think it's the responsibility of all of us when we hear something like that or see something like that to speak up, to point it out politely but firmly, to try and explain to the extent we can why it is wrong, what it is wrong, and how it should be done differently in the future. I think this is all really hard, to be honest. I mean, it's easy to recognize when something is wrong. It is hard to address it, and it is hard to make it different for the future. But that is the work that we have to do if we are going to get there. And so I think that requires some level of bravery, some level of courage, a willingness to separate yourself from the group. Particularly for those of us who are white and hear other white people saying things that are problematic, you have to be courageous and willing to separate yourself from the group to stand up for what is right. But that is what the moment demands. That is what right and wrong demands. I don't think there's any magic trick to it. There's not any special set of like 5 words that you say that makes it all better and washes it away and makes it easy. It's really based on the moment and the situation, but all of us have an obligation to do that, and always, again, to recognize the power dynamics that are at play to make sure that we are keeping everyone as safe as possible while we do that.
I'll pick up where Micah left off. Dr. Kubic left off. He said, recognize the power dynamics at play. I think that is a crucial point, particularly in the workplace. So you have to ask yourself about leadership in this particular role. Is leadership of the organization, are they apathetic when it comes to racism or sexism? Are they sympathetic to the racist or to the sexist? Or are they opposed? That is, they are intolerant to racism or sexism or homophobia or whatever the case might be. Or they are looking to be anti-racist. They have institutions and programming within the workplace that you can appeal to. If the answer is that they are anti-racist or they want to be anti-racist, or they are intolerant to racism, sexism, and that sort of stuff, then you should easily be able to find within the organization educational outlets and institutional outlets that you can appeal to, that leadership will be 100% supportive and engaged and active with you when you address the situation. So you might just go to leadership, find out about your organization, and then use those structures to address the problem, particularly if the problem is recurrent, because there might be something going on that leadership doesn't know. But let's assume the problem is recurrent and leadership is fully aware of it. In that case, you might have leadership that's apathetic and they just don't care. Or they might be supportive. They might actually believe the same things. In those cases, you might be in a more difficult situation and you have to start asking yourself, is this the place you want to be? And if it is the place that you want to be, then you'll have to try to see if you can change leadership. If it's not the place that you want to be, then you have to position yourself to find better jobs in other places that won't harm you psychologically or emotionally, or as Micah pointed out, sometimes physically. And then the other question you might ask yourself is, what is your relationship? So there are power dynamics and then there are personal dynamics. What is your relationship with the person who is saying the racist stuff? Is it a family member? Is it a friend? Is it an associate that you can go to and have a personal one-on-one conversation with the person? Often I say to people, avoid grandstanding, because if you stand up in the middle of the room and try to make a big show out of it, mostly people are going to turn off because they don't want the confrontation, or the person who's saying it is going to have a recoil effect where they feel attacked and then they have to respond back at you in an aggressive manner, saying that you misunderstood them, they're not a racist, and you're falsely accusing them and that sort of stuff. But if you have a personal relationship with them or a strong acquaintance relationship, you could always go to the person's office or have lunch with the person and sit down and have a personal conversation. I find that over time, those personal conversations will help people change. Sometimes the racist is acting out, like you find with children, and that person needs outlets to be guided towards change. Always realize that if you're going to engage with somebody personally, there is, as Micah pointed out, there are no 5 words you can say, right? You are a racist, and then it goes away, right? You have to be willing to spend a lot of time helping individuals engage in personal development and growth, and that only happens over time. So I'd say start by looking at the professional dynamics of your organization, and then think about the personal dynamics that you have with the individual, and then ask yourself, do you want to engage with this person over time to help them do the personal growth that's necessary? Finally, there are some people who are just racist, and there's nothing you can do. So you think about the personal dynamics, you think about the professional dynamics, and this person is a proud boy. Well, if he's a proud boy, there's going to be little you can do to get him help him do the personal growth and change. It's going to be a lifelong project in that case, I'm afraid. But for you, you should think about those things and see where you can engage to make things better at your workplace.
Thank you very much. The next question I have is, what roles do colleges play in uphold institutional racism, and what responsibilities should they have in combating it?
I think there's no question that colleges, institutions of higher education, are an important part of the country. They help set the tone. They prepare young people for what is to come. And so they have both a special obligation and a special ability to help redirect the path here. I think, again, if we're looking historically, we have to admit and acknowledge that until very recently, colleges and universities were places that were churning out huge amounts of racism, scientific racism, historical, like there's a whole school of history, the Dunning School, which is about how Black people weren't capable of governing themselves after Reconstruction. And so you needed the Ku Klux Klan to come in and save the day. And that was the dominant history that was being turned out by professors, by colleges, well into the 1960s and 70s. And so, colleges, universities, higher education help get us into the problems that we are in, but also have an ability to turn things around. And that means that we should take advantage of that opportunity. It means that we need to make sure that curricula are inclusive and based on what actually happened and are reflective of reality rather than purely ideological points of view. It means that the instructional staff and administrative staff need to reflect the broader population of the country, and especially the institutions that they serve. And it means that all of us in this country need to do a much better job of making sure that the student bodies are more representative of the country at large as well, that they look like the people who live in this country and not just a subset of upper class white people.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with what Dr. Kubic said. We often think about colleges and universities as places where you'll find great enlightenment and no racism. Well, that's false. It turns out that, as Dr. Kubic pointed out, that colleges were churning out racists with scientific racism back in the day, but I point out they're still doing it. Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray published a book called The Bell Curve, in which they argue that African Americans are genetically, intellectually inferior to European Americans. And that book has gotten much acclaim. In fact, it was on the New York Times bestsellers list for months. And then there's a guy named Nicholas Capaldi who produced a book in which he argues that African Americans are morally inferior to European Americans. So it's not that they're not as smart, it's that they're bad. And so in Capaldi's book, he goes on about what we have to do is have great oversight of African Americans. And that book was produced in 2006. And then I met a guy at a conference once. I went to a professional conference. I met a guy who said, what we need is to put drones in over African American communities because that's where the crime occurs. And I said, should those be predator drones or just surveillance drones? Now, of course, I was being funny and everybody laughed, but given half a chance, there are some who would say, yeah, they ought to be predator drones. And so there are colleges and universities that support this stuff. There are colleges and universities that teach it to their students. And it's up first. People have got to speak out, as we told you before, against those colleges and universities, or at the very least, write articles in response to those professors who write this sort of stuff. I've done so myself. And then on the other hand, colleges and universities have a great responsibility to be inclusive, to have expertise on the campus that reflects the inclusivity that they're trying to achieve. So for example, if you're a college that services the state of Florida, your student body should be somewhat reflective of the state of Florida. Your professional professors should be reflective of the state of Florida. Your administration should be reflective of the state of Florida because that's who you service. And so colleges and universities have a responsibility, not just with respect to the student body, but with respect to the professors and with respect to the subject matter expertise and with respect to the administration. And so they have great roles that they can play in changing the tenor of the conversation and also preparing young people to help America move forward. Remember, it's been 233 years since we've been dealing with this. So I realize it's not going to happen overnight, but it's not going to happen at all if we don't get busy.
I just want to add one more thing because something that Dr. Smaw said triggered. Like I think there is sometimes this narrative, this belief that if we just educate people, that education is the solution to getting rid of racism, and that educated people are not racist and uneducated people are racist. And that's a load of nonsense, right? The single most racist, most white supremacist person I've ever met in my life had a PhD from Oxford University, and the most realistic, grounded, courageous, anti-racist person I've ever met in my life had a 6th grade education and grew up in Dumas, Arkansas. Racism, anti-racism is not about education. It is not a choice about facts. It is not a choice about reality. It is a moral choice. And unless we divorce ourselves from this narrative that education is the solution rather than the moral choice, we're going to keep on having those same problems that Dr. Smaw was talking about.
Thank you both for your answers. It's just been a pleasure being a part of this entire important conversation. And throughout these course of weeks that we've been preparing for this, I've been more and more excited to listen to Dr. Kubic and Dr. Smaw to speak about this important topic. I'd like to pass it back on to Zachary as we kind of conclude our event, and I'm looking forward, and I thank you all for attending.
Thank you again, Marcus, and thank you to everyone that submitted questions. I know we had a lot of great feedback that was messaged to me. I know we had a lot of great questions submitted ahead of time that we couldn't get to because of time, but just wanted to thank everyone again for joining us. We're going to go ahead and end our webinar as we close in at 1 p.m. Thank you again to everyone for taking the time to join us today, and special thanks to our guests, Dr. Kubic, Dr. Smaw, and Marcus. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with a list of the resources recommended by Dr. Smaw and Dr. Kubic, as well as a recording of this event. You can follow college updates, learn more about upcoming events, and how to support great students like Marcus by visiting our Share the Light website at sharethelight.rollins.org, and I'll be posting that link in the chat before we head out. And other than that, I hope everyone has a great day.